Charlie, you are on mute.
It's already starting. No, I'm already making like the biggest mistake. Thank you. Hopefully that'll be the only one happening so far. I was saying hello, and I was making a terrible joke about how it's lovely to see your faces, but I don't see your faces except for my lovely co-presenters here, who have very lovely faces. That said, I am thrilled to be here with y'all today. So whether you're with us live or watching this later, this is a topic that's deeply important to all three of us, and hopefully you as well, otherwise you wouldn't be here or watching this. So, welcome to Practice Not Perfect. Myself, Carolyn, and Kristen are here today to encourage and support you through diversifying your guest list, which can feel really intimidating. And this is so you can continue to have thoughtful and inclusive conversations depending on what kind of podcast you have. So, this could be because it's part of your values, some feedback you've been given, or a way you're intentionally seeking to improve the experience of the podcast overall, both for your guests and also for folks that are listening. And we have a lot of great topics to dive into today. And before we introduce ourselves, I want to get into some housekeeping items. And as you can see, again, practice, not perfect. Lots of emphasis on that. So, before we get started, we are going to save Q&A for the end. However, we absolutely want you to take advantage of the Q&A box at the bottom of Zoom. So please, at any point, go ahead and enter your question. We don't want you to lose it. It's just we're going to save that for the end so that we can make sure we can get through all the material today. And there is going to be a blog post that'll get linked to later in the Zoom chat. And it's going to include a lot of what we talk about today, but also give you a lot more specifics so that you can get even more examples. And we want you to participate to your comfort level. We don't want to have you be voluntold to do something in the chat. So we will be prompting you to join us on a few activities. However, if you don't want to, totally okay. Understand. So chat messages are encouraged, emojis are encouraged. So please feel free to do that. That said, our biggest goal for today, the inspiration for our Practice Not Perfect event, comes from a core intention we established, the three of us, when we were crafting this session. It is so easy to get tangled in the quest for perfection for some of us, whether it's choosing our podcast name, designing the cover, creating taglines, whatever all of that looks like, right? There's a lot of different elements to podcasting. So often, this pursuit of perfection can prevent us from even getting started or continuing to grow. So our main goal for today is simple but powerful. Imagine there's like da 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 drums happening. Thank you, Kristen. We want to inspire you to make one change. So we aim to inspire you to make one meaningful change to your podcast moving forward from what you learned today. And we will share a wealth of information. And I encourage you to tune in to what truly resonates with you. So maybe jot down some ideas if you have, pad and paper if you're old school like that, or however you take your notes. But jot down some of those insights that strike a chord with you. And our hope is that by the end of our session, we will encourage you to start with just one actionable change of something that you will be doing moving forward. And, maybe once you've implemented that and you feel confident, you can move on to another. But today we are just asking you to focus on one thing that you will commit to doing differently moving forward. And for example, when I reflect on my own podcast journey, which I'll discuss a bit later, I prioritize on focusing on one improvement for each season. Just one thing that season that I'm like, I want to be very intentional about this thing and getting better at it, whatever that looks like. So, again, as you explore the many insights and options we'll share today, remember this: practice implementing one change until it's good enough, and only good enough because perfection, we don't have time for that, until it's good enough before potentially moving on to the next thing. Now, let's talk about who we are in the first place, right? Who are these weirdos? I'll speak for myself. Who is this weirdo with you today? So, hi, I'm Charlie. My pronouns are they, them. I'm an LGBTQ plus speaker, trainer, consultant, podcaster. The list goes on thanks to my ADHD, and I love it. My podcast is called Allyship is a Verb. It is for adults in the messy practice of LGBTQ plus allyship. I'm originally from Los Angeles. These days, I live in Denver, Colorado. And I've been very fortunate that my podcast has been nominated 4 times. Two for the Ambies, so thank you, Podcast Academy, and then two for the Sonic Bloom Awards. And actually, earlier this year, Allyship is a Verb won the Rainbow Mic Award with them. So it's been really exciting. Thank you, Kristen, for the claps. Thank you, Carolyn. No forced peer pressure there. But it's been very, very exciting for myself and my very, very tiny yet mighty team. Um, and I'm also a former Podcast Academy mentee. So that's also how I met Kristen. Lots of interesting ways the three of us met. So I love it. So next we will meet Carolyn. Remember to unmute.
Thank you. Yes. Hello, everybody. My name is Carolyn Keel. I am the host of a podcast called Beyond 6 Seconds, which goes beyond 6-second first impressions to share the real life lived experiences of neurodivergent and disabled people. So I started podcasting with my show back in 2018 and shifted the focus to neurodivergence in 2022, shortly after I was diagnosed with the late diagnosis of autism myself. So I've just really enjoyed getting to know and learn more about people's experience with their own neurodivergence. I've also won a few awards. I've been happy enough and honored enough to be recognized by a few from the Signal Awards, W3 Awards, and I was also nominated recently for an Ambie. So I'm very happy to be here. And now I will send it over to Kristen.
Hi, I'm in such esteemed company. These, nominated and awarded podcasters. So my name is Kristen Quiroz Bayona. I am from Northern California, and I am the head of podcast strategy and client success for a podcast network. We focus on people first leadership and coaches. I've been podcasting since 2020, and I'm the host of Podcast and Amplify. And so my podcast is dedicated to amplifying underrepresented female voices in entrepreneurship. I actually started with a travel podcast in 2020, and the through line between that podcast and my current one is that podcast focused on underrepresented voices in travel, because typically we see, I think historically, white men sharing their travel blogs and they're being the hosts of travel shows. So that mission started there, and then it's continued into the work that I do today. And that's a little bit about all of us. So let's dive into really why we're here. So we're here talking about how to diversify your guest list, but why is this important? So really, what is the value in inviting diverse voices onto your podcast? How is this going to make your podcast better? Because that's really what a lot of us are aiming to do. Like Charlie said, they focus on one thing that's going to move the needle every season or every year. And so, what is that value? And here, this is me being imperfect because I'm using an app, Canva app, for the first time. So you'll probably see me move forward and move back, and hopefully won't get too crazy. But so when we invite these diverse communities onto our show, we're really able to tap into the full spectrum of humanity and all of its complexity And that means that we're creating content and episodes that resonate with a broader audience. And it means that those episodes that we're sharing, they're that much more impactful because we're hearing from different perspectives, we're getting different experiences, and we're getting knowledge that maybe, we just don't have. And at the same time, we're doing those very important things of creating connection, breaking down barriers, challenging assumptions we might have from people from different communities than our own, and then also increasing representation. And we all know how important representation is. So this is what I skipped to, spoiled a little bit. But when you think of diversifying your podcast, what are 2 to 3 feelings that come up for you? And go ahead and type that into the chat. And I'm going to ask Carolyn and Charlie to share. But first, I'll share what it feels like for me. I'll go first. For me, it feels like fun because I really love learning new things. I love learning from other people and getting those fresh perspectives, and that feels like fun. I think I want to acknowledge for some people, there could be a little bit of nerves that come up because, you're inviting people maybe you're not used to, you don't know their stories as well. And that can feel like, oh, what if I make a mistake or what if I get something wrong? So we are going to talk about that later, but I'd love to know, Carolyn, Charlie, like, what is one thing that comes up for you when you think of diversifying your podcast list?
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. For me, it's I I get excited honestly because like you, and I'm sure like many of us on the call now, I really am very interested in learning. It's one of the main reasons that I began my podcast, and I'm really just curious to learn more about people's different experiences, and everybody has a different story. So I get excited when I think of new possibilities for either new people I can talk to, new things I can learn as well. So yeah, and I see that Aaliyah put in the chat excitement. Yes, same here, and fun, as Kristen said, and curiosity too. That's a big one. Really great.
I'm an anxious person by default. That's just like my baseline. So I'm gonna it's fun and I get nervous. I get super nervous because I have conversations with people from various LGBTQ plus communities, and I'm very intentional about not amplifying the same voices that we hear time and time again. So, like, especially white gay men who are also probably cisgender. And in that, it can feel tokenizing. That's why I get nervous. So there's that aspect of it. Like, okay, I've already had like 3 lesbians, and then okay, also I need people who are older, also, and in I can spiral out as you're starting to hear. Again, all of this is just my default. I somehow make it through. However, I do get nervous. And with that tokenization, I'm also very careful about when I ask people and invite them to be on the podcast as a potential guest. Because first we have a conversation just to see, is there enough rapport? Like, how would this go? What would they like to talk about? But so, for example, during Black History Month here in the States, I'm not trying to ask Black people if they can be on the podcast. That feels like a no-no. So I don't do that. I'm very intentional about asking outside of that, as one example. Or people maybe who are intersex, for example. I don't want to have their episode necessarily released around that awareness event or that celebratory event. Now, I think sometimes it can be great, and if they themselves, the guests, suggest that, like, oh, if there's a possibility to have it around this date, and I've done that in the past. More recently, had a guest on who's asexual, among many tons of other identities, and wanted me explicitly to have it around one of the asexuality awareness events because a survey was being launched and wanted to reach as many people as possible. So, if a guest is suggesting that, then I feel better. But those are just some of the ways. So I'm just gonna come in hard with like the nerves and also nerves around like making sure I get it right. And
Mm.
not because I'm not comfortable with making mistakes. I'll be talking about that a lot later. But yeah, nerves. So that's my long monologue because the ADHD is strong this morning over here. But I want to be honest about that. So it just feels like this delicate balance of just okay, age-wise, internationality wise, like where people are globally, just all of those things, and not too many, we're not hearing from too many of the same maybe intersections and things like that. So yeah, that's
Yeah,
that's me.
I think you probably shared a lot of what many of us have felt and are feeling. I I have done both. So I've done there's Latinx Heritage Month. Well, I'm Mexican American, so for me that makes sense. Like I'm going to devote my show to this, but then, outside of that, I'm kind of like, you know what? If I'm doing a good job with my diversity goals, then I shouldn't really need to like segment, like you said, like Black History Month. So that's kind of how but it's personal and it's, your values come into play. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later because we really want everyone to, for the one thing that they're going to do, that make sure that it's in integrity with, who they are and what their show is and how they want to show up and participate in, creating a diverse podcast community. But thank you so much for sharing. Um, and so we talked about why it's important. Let's talk about why it's up to us. So, let's talk about the landscape right now. We are seeing censorship of different communities in the form of book bans, legislation being passed, social media algorithms and how they operate. And even in the corporate space, you're seeing a lot of deprioritizing of diversity, equity, and inclusion commitments that were made and are being sort of backtracked. So that's the landscape that we're in right now. And so it's really up to us because there isn't like a cavalry, there isn't one person or even one group that's going to come in and boom, magic wand, all podcasts are inclusive and diverse. And it's really at the individual level and at that grassroots level, that we can affect change. So it's up to us to create the change that we want to see. So like I mentioned before, I started my travel podcast because diversity was something that I saw lacking and I wanted to use my platform for that. And so we just have such a big opportunity to create that change and make this community what we want it to be. So you might be thinking, yeah, that sounds great. I'm down. Let's do this. But there also might be another part of you, as Charlie mentioned, that is feeling like, what if I get this wrong? Like, what if I unintentionally offend someone, tokenize someone, just fall on my face, basically. And so I want you to think about back to that first time you ever recorded a podcast episode and think about all the mistakes you may have made from that first time to where you're at now. You probably, if you're like me, stumbled over your words and it probably took you like 30,000 times to record your first episode. I don't know if anyone can relate, but that's what it was like for me. Maybe you were recording with a guest and you forgot to silence your alerts or you forgot to press record, like my personal worst nightmare scenario, or maybe when you published your episode, it went live and you had like a minute of dead air. Like that's happened to me too. So these are all mistakes that we've made starting out, and there's just so many ways to get things wrong when you're starting out because you're starting out and it's new. So thinking about, reaching out to other communities that maybe you're not as familiar with, it can feel vulnerable. And it can also feel like the stakes are higher, right? So there's the potential for offending someone, using outdated language, using someone's wrong pronouns, not saying someone's name correctly, asking something that is inappropriate that you didn't even know was inappropriate. So there's some things that you have to navigate, right? And there's potential for mistakes. But I want you to consider, how would you feel if you let all those initial podcast mistakes stop you from continuing? Say you recorded your first episode, it went horribly, and you're like, no, I'm out. I'm done. Like I can't do, I can't do this anymore. And so I know for me, I was super nervous. My voice was shaking. And I pushed through though. And I'm so glad that I did because I wouldn't have gained the confidence. I wouldn't have improved how I'm speaking to you today. I think it's improved. And it actually led me to speaking at a podcast conference. So there's so much to be gained by, putting ourselves out there and making those mistakes. And so we just really want to, I think all of us here wanted to acknowledge that it is messy, it can feel messy in the beginning, and we really want to normalize making those mistakes. And as Charlie referenced before at the beginning of this, like you can't grow without being uncomfortable. And, if we can remember to give ourselves grace through this process and also hold yourself accountable when you make those mistakes, that's very important too. And that's what's going to help us embrace that messy and create content that is really going to resonate deeply with our audiences. So really at the heart of this, and I talked about this a few minutes ago, is, all of us have core values that are connected to our podcast why. And, our values can really guide us when we're setting our diversity goals, and how we approach those, achieving those goals. So we're each going to go over our core values and share about, a little bit about what that means to us and our podcasts. So my top three values for just in life are connection, empowerment, and inspiration. And so how empowerment shows up for me is I really want to, in my podcast, is I really want to empower female entrepreneurs who haven't historically seen themselves as these business owners, these leaders, to, see themselves, hear themselves, and say like, hey, I can do that. That person sounds just like me, and it's something that I can achieve. So that empowerment piece is just really a core value and drives like how I create my show.
Great, thanks, Kristen. So yeah, here are my core values. You can see they're amplification, representation, and learning. And let's talk briefly about these. With amplification, sometimes as podcast hosts, we might feel pressure or the expectation to really focus on guests who have a big following, or like, oh, I want like the super popular celebrity guest, for some formats of our shows, but that doesn't necessarily provide the best content. So for my personal core value as I approach my podcast is my show is really about amplifying voices and stories that aren't often heard from, or just don't necessarily have the platform or the visibility that I feel like they should. So, I don't, although I wouldn't be averse to interviewing a celebrity, but most of my guests have just been people with stories who I've really found fascinating. Like, even if I'm just like reading an article in a local newspaper about someone who's doing some really great work in their small town, in their community, I would interview them and learn more about their story. Because a lot of times those smaller stories really have the most impact or are the most resonating with my listeners. So that's what I found with that. And then of course representation, which we'll talk more about throughout the presentation here, and learning, of course. So through my show, I've learned so much about neurodivergence and different neurotypes, and it's really expanded my own understanding of what neurodiversity really looks like, and how people experience it in different ways. So that's how my core values translate over. So I'll now forward it to Charlie.
Well, thank you, Carolyn. Uh, I just like being awkward. It's my natural. When thinking about the core values of allyship as a verb and all of the intentions I was setting right from the beginning, it felt like joy, belonging, and authenticity came up loudest for me. Joy and belonging are two that are part of like my personal values. And the authenticity piece feels critical, I believe, for my show because when you think about different LGBTQ plus communities and some of the stories that we can hear over and over again, it can feel like maybe there's not hope for us, or if I don't see myself in this person's story. So, like thinking about trans stories that get amplified, or things like that, or non-binary identities maybe that get amplified. If folks are questioning, like, oh, maybe I'm trans, maybe I'm non-binary, if they're not hearing some of their same experiences in those stories, they may feel like, oh, there isn't space for me. Like, I'm not trans enough, I'm not non-binary enough, I'm not queer enough, I'm not like what, and then feel like maybe they don't have access to those spaces. And something that has brought me so much joy is that sometimes when I hear from folks who listen to the various episodes, because it can feel at times like you're listening in on a conversation, but with consent, uh, there's a lot of folks who end up feeling very validated, either because someone's pronouns have changed and they didn't feel like they could do that because they've already changed it once, or different things like that. There's going to be someone on my show who's bigger presence in the trans community, for example. And he is very typecast for a very particular thing. And so when we had our pre-call, I was like, listen, I know who you are. Like everyone, not necessarily, but like everyone knows who you are. So and you're typecast to this very specific topic. So I want to know, do you want to continue to talk about this topic, or is there something else you're hoping to talk about? Because something that's also important to me in that authenticity piece is that folks don't feel like they're just doing this podcast tour. They're getting the same questions, giving the same answers, right? And it becomes almost like second nature, like you can do it on autopilot. I don't want my guests to have that experience. And I also want to surprise them by having listened to maybe other episodes they've been on and like following up on those questions and making sure people listening can have that context. So I want people to show up as they want to. I want them to only disclose any identities that they feel comfortable sharing. And yeah, I think that's part of what makes allyship as a verb special, is that I'm not just putting people in a box, making them only answer like certain kinds of questions. I want to know what they want to share. So that's what feels really important for me. And those are just some of the ways those values come up in how I do things.
I love it. So, I think you can see that we're all very, very tied to our values for our podcasts, as I'm sure all of you are. So, what's one value that you think reflects your podcast? We'd love it if you could share it in the chat. We've obviously talked about our values. I love that, Charlie. You're making me think of like, an example I can use is like, as people type what their values are, is like just there are different experiences even within the same community, right? There's so much diversity even within the same community. So there's like first generation, second generation, third generation, which is they're all totally different on this spectrum, right? And then you were sharing a little bit about like the different spectrum that you have, and then you can go outside of that even. So there's just like so much, you're reminding me there's so much richness and there's so much value in validating other people's experiences, which I really loved. So yeah. All right. Well, we'll give, if people pop in their values, we'll check on those. I think I'm going to hand it off to Carolyn. She's going to dive into our mindset.
Great. Thanks so much, Tristan. So so we've, now we've learned more about what's important for your podcast in terms of values. Here's kind of how to get yourself into the right mindset as a podcast host. So first, starting off, what do we mean by mindset? So I found this definition here that I thought was pretty relevant to what we're talking about today. So it's a particular way of thinking, a set of beliefs, attitudes, and perspectives that shape how we interpret and respond to the world around us. So if you kind of think of your values as the why for your podcast, like why you're doing a particular podcast and sort of the why behind it, like the mindset is more like connected to the how, like how will you demonstrate those values in the way that you approach your podcast from, beginning to end, the way that you find and select your guests and conduct your interviews and maybe even market your episodes and kind of everything in between. So I'll share a little bit about my own mindset as a podcast host. And, some I think I've kind of alluded to when I was talking about learning as a value. One way that I show that through my own, mindset here is by just having a mindset of curiosity. So I am very interested in learning about people's experiences and their own stories. I just find like one-on-one stories really compelling and interesting and just so helpful for connecting, connecting those experiences and making people feel, less alone if they're going through something or learning about something. So, based on the guest research that I do before I hit record, as I'm preparing for the interview, I may write some open-ended questions that will give my guests the time and space to share. And then when I'm listening, I try not to interrupt them too much. I really only interrupt if I feel like something needs clarification for the listener. And then, from there, when difficult topics come up, I also approach those with curiosity too. Sometimes that leads to new insights from my guest, for myself, or for my listeners. And the fact that you've all come here to attend this presentation shows that you also have curiosity in your probably as part of your own mindsets too when it comes to your podcast. The second one for me is vulnerability. So a lot of my guests are sharing really emotional and vulnerable stories on my show. So I really do everything I can to make them as comfortable as possible and as we were saying, try to avoid some of those potential mistakes or things that we worry about as podcasters in terms of missteps. So a lot of the things I really try to prepare beforehand by letting my guests know what they can expect when they come to the show. Again, sharing either interview topics or potential questions. And, while my focus is really on my guest story, I'm not afraid of being vulnerable myself. So I really try to share similar experiences, even during the podcast with, if my guest is talking about something, I'll relate briefly to it, but then bring the focus right back to my guest so that I'm not sort of changing the conversation, but it becomes more of a back and forth conversation at that point. And I feel like that's really powerful for people to hear. And then my third piece of my mindset is being open to feedback. So, as I mentioned earlier, I'm always learning with every guest conversation that I have. And, even when I'm feeling prepared and I feel like I've done all the research I can and I'm ready, things may come up and I know I won't always get everything right. So I'm always open to getting feedback from my guests. I always follow up with them later. It's part of my episode prep process to let them know that, they can provide input into what we talk about. And, Yeah, and just confirm that they're okay with all of the topics, and give them everything that they can be to be successful in the interview. And one thing in terms of real time feedback that I've used during my episodes is that I'll try to, if my guest has talked and shared for a long time, sort of a longer answer, a lot of times I'll try to kind of briefly rephrase or kind of restate what they've said. One for my listener to kind of help gear the conversation and pull out some important points from the story, but it also helps me confirm and move the conversation forward. So usually in those cases, one of two things happens. So I'll rephrase something that my guest has said, and they'll say something like, oh, yeah, that's exactly it. And furthermore, and go on, and the conversation will continue from there. Or if I don't get it quite right, they'll be like, oh, no, it's not quite like that. It's actually like this. And then the conversation goes on. So whether or not I get it completely perfectly or completely right with the rephrasing, that can be really helpful. Getting that real-time feedback, and it actually helps enrich the episode, because then a lot of times I'll wind up getting more insights from sort of doing that brief rephrasing and moving on from there as well. And so, Kristen, I'll hand it to you, Kristen.
You hand it to me? Okay.
Yes.
So we wanted to talk a little bit about values and mindset, to really set anyone up thinking about this, for creating really intentional representation goals. So it's the values, the mindset, and then we got to take action. We got to do the thing. So this next section, we're gonna dive into the how of it. How do we start working towards this goal? There is a blog post that went live. I believe it went live today. And it goes more in depth into each of these things that I'll be covering. I have about 3 on each slide, but I'm going to give you just kind of a quick rundown of all of them, and then dive into one. So I find it helpful when I set my diversity goals for my podcast guests. I always find it helpful to do a podcast audit. So I'm looking at who's been on my show, who do I want to invite on my show that I haven't, heard from, what are those gaps and what are those opportunities? I think that's a great place to start in a lot of things that I do. And then, after when you're setting your goals, you can think about, if you have a certain demographic that your show skews towards, so like maybe you have a STEM podcast and that leans more towards white male. So then you'll want to be intentional about how you fill those gaps. So that could look like reaching out to certain organizations, something like Hacking the Workforce. They have a mission of creating an inclusive cyber industry. So just really being specific about whose voices do I want to include, and that way who you reach out to can be very specific, and that's just going to like save you time instead of just like throwing things at the wall and kind of wasting your time. And then also we want to think about, and I think Carolyn can speak to this as well, is that representation isn't always visible. We don't always know. So there's especially for like someone in the neurodivergent space, like we don't always know. It's not always obvious. So we want to keep that in mind. Like how can we include as many people as possible? And so for outreach, so after you've done your research and you've set your goals, there are several ways that you can reach out. Social media, you can look at hashtags for certain groups. You can ask people in your community or past guests that you've had on. One of the things that I like to use is LinkedIn groups. So for example, there was a point in my podcast where I was like, I'm not having enough Black voices on my show from the entrepreneur community. And so what's really great about LinkedIn is you can get very specific and literally type in Black entrepreneur community and then, select people. And then you can look at, who's in those spaces, who is connected to them. And that really helps you, it helped me to really find the people that I was looking for and be able to start conversations and have them on my show. I could see, what are they posting? What do they like to talk about? And so some of the groups, though, are closed to people who are not inside of that, demographic, and that's fine. You could, in those cases, you could reach out to the admins and ask for a recommendation. Or you can, send like a DM to someone, specifically that you've seen in that community. And, because you might be working with communities that are new to you, they may need different things than you have thought of before. And some of those things might be like accommodations that are really going to help you have a successful interview. So Carolyn is really great at creating that space where conversations are successful, as she just passionately talked about, how she, asks for feedback and listens. And so she's going to share with us some of her approaches to accommodations.
Great. Thanks, Kristen. So, yeah, we've been talking about the guest selection process and how to find, guests with diverse backgrounds and experiences. But we also want to talk about kind of being inclusive through the interview process. So, we're really looking at, diversification and providing that inclusion through the entire podcast production process. So, for this, when I'm talking about being inclusive and inclusion when it comes to podcasting and our topic here today, it's really how do you make your guests feel as comfortable and supported as possible on your podcast and in all your podcast related interactions with them. Because one, that's the right thing to do as a human to human conversation that we have with our guests, and two, it also helps set you and your guest up for success to have a really great interview and create a really powerful and wonderful episode together. So one big way to be inclusive, as Kristen was saying, is to basically and make your guests feel supported and comfortable is by offering accommodations to your guest on your podcast. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by accommodations. People may have heard of that term in like kind of a disability space related standpoint, or maybe like in a legal standpoint or a workplace standpoint. But in this case, when we approach with podcasting, I'm really looking at accommodations as a very broad term. So how I describe it is, accommodations are changes and adjustments to your process and the environment that make things more usable and easier for as many people as possible. So you'll never get a situation where a space or an environment is like absolutely 100% like perfect for everyone, because everyone has different needs. But it's really the mindset and the approach to offering those accommodations to make things more accessible to wider groups of people. So, while accommodations have historically been created mainly to support disabled folks, really anyone can benefit from accommodations. In fact, we, every day probably benefit from accommodations in our environment in ways we may not even realize. So one way to illustrate this, I have this illustration here that I really like for the curb cut effect. And this relates to some legislation that was passed several decades ago about literally lowering sections of curb, like you see, you may be able to see illustrated there. And the legislation was passed by or advocated for by disability advocates, and it was passed to accommodate wheelchairs. But as you can see in this illustration, it benefits so many more people. So it could be, people who are, they may not use wheelchairs, but they're pushing strollers, they're pushing dollies or hand carts, riding skateboards, riding bicycles, and any number of things. While that curb cut is an accommodation that was originally created for the disability community, it wound up benefiting a wide variety of people. And, some other common accommodations that many of us use, including myself, are, everyday things we consider everyday things like, eyeglasses, elevators, subtitles or captions when you're looking at TV or videos on social media, even things like spell check or autocorrect, or even working remotely, which many of us began doing, especially over the past few years. So a lot of times accommodations are become very normalized in society. So it's overall the point is with this, they're not just for people who are disabled, although that tends to be my focus because my podcasts focus on disability and neurodivergence. But in the end, they're really helpful for everyone. And you may even find that you're offering accommodations in your podcast process without even realizing it. But it's kind of a nice call out here, and I can help you kind of think proactively about it. So it can be very helpful to do that, and it will absolutely improve your guest experience with that. So again, because accommodations really can have benefits to a wide variety of people, including many of your guests on your show, we want to actually offer them, but then kind of how do you figure out which accommodations would help your guests? There's so many different things that you could provide. And, after all, you can't necessarily tell what someone needs based on their appearance. Like, for example, as this graphic here shows, not all disabilities are visible. So you may not know if your guest has a disability or not. But you know what? That's okay, because since accommodations help everyone, you don't need to know if your guest has a disability. And you don't need to ask them if they have a disability. You can still provide those accommodations, or at least, and I'll show you how to do that exactly. So, instead of asking specifically like that, unless it's something that your guest brings up, but you can ask all of your guests something like a standard question, like, is there anything I can do to make this interview more comfortable for you? And that kind of opens it up to, it's a very broad question, and it really gives your guests the opportunity to talk about any number of things that they're aware of that is really helpful for them personally. And then based on their answer, you can provide whatever accommodation that they basically asked for that would support their needs. Again, this works whether or not your guest has a disability or whether or not you know that. And also, it's helpful to think about some accommodations that you can offer upfront to your guests. Then you're not necessarily putting, your guest doesn't have that burden to kind of disclose or proactively ask when you're prepping your episodes. Or, even worse, if they feel like they're not comfortable enough to ask and they kind of struggle through the interview because they were reluctant to ask for something that really would have been helpful for them. So, if you offer a few up front, that also kind of signals that, like, hey, I'm open, I have enough flexibility and I'm open enough to be able to offer these things that may or may not be helpful to you. Does this help? Are there other things that could be helpful as well? And I'll share some examples of possible accommodations that you could offer upfront in just a minute here. And then, of course, guests may tell you directly exactly what they need. So I recommend being open and flexible, listening to what they have to say and seeing how you might be able to support them in that process as well. I think of the word accommodations as, it relates, you're basically like, it's tied to how you invite guests over to your podcast, but it's kind of similar to like inviting guests over to your home. Like, you would want your guests to feel comfortable. You would probably think about, all right, well, maybe I need to have certain food and beverages, or what kind of food does this person like, or are there particular allergy or dietary restrictions, or you want to make sure that they had directions to your home. So all that planning that you do to have someone over to your home is kind of similar to the type of planning that you do to have someone over to your podcast. So that's kind of how I think about accommodations, and just really making sure that people feel comfortable when they are on my show, as comfortable as they possibly can be. So here I'll share some examples of possible accommodations, and talk about them a little bit, just to get the ideas flowing and give you a few ideas here. Ones that I offer upfront proactively, because they tend to be pretty popular with my guests, is this first one here, sending questions in advance. So I'm autistic, and I really, as a podcast host, feel the need to be as prepared as possible when I'm talking and having a conversation with someone. So for me, I'm already doing a lot of this prep, and I am thinking of, not every single question, because I do ask questions on the fly, but I do have a general idea of what I want to ask people about during my interview. And often I will strip those questions out, even just for myself. So I started sharing those with my guests about a week ahead of time. And the feedback I got from my guests who are also neurodivergent and also tend to really value being able to prepare for conversations like this is that it was really helpful. So that works for my show because, that's just it's comfortable for my guests, and it happens to work well for my needs as a podcast host as well. So sending questions in advance is an easy one, especially if that's already part of your prep process, or offering to. And I always make the point of, I don't need their answers to come in advance to me. It's really just so they have the questions to prepare and think about their answers, and then they can just tell me on the show, and then we'll flow the conversation from there. So for the most part, I don't need the answers back. That is something I have had to clarify over time, because sometimes people would write me back the answers, which is fine, but not necessarily. I don't need to give them necessarily the written homework, but yeah, it's one of those things that you learn as you offer accommodations, kind of how people respond to them, how popular they are, and you kind of make those adjustments over time as you work from guest to guest. Another thing I really find valuable is describing what to expect during the interview. So, providing questions in advance is a small part of that. But, before we do the interview, I send a lot of information and share a lot of information about, okay, well, this is when I'm going to send you the questions. This is when I'm going to send you the meeting link. It's going to come like this in a meeting invitation. Here are some things to keep in mind. Information about what kind of audio or microphone, or should they wear headphones, or what kind of platform can they use. So all those details and those logistical things can be helpful for people to know up front, so that they're not nervous the day of and trying to figure out like, oh no, like, I should have worn headphones, but like they're not, I don't have them. And so it prevents a lot of the last minute scramble when you're starting your recording. And it also helps your guest feel at ease and gives them that opportunity to prepare for your episode. And related to that, I always build in a little extra time at the beginning before we ever press record to do microphone checks and technology checks, because we're all podcasters, and probably many times we've had that experience of, you think you've got everything set up and it worked 10 minutes ago, and then you connect to the meeting and then like the audio's out or something like that. So I usually, even though my episodes, when they're edited down, are usually about 30 minutes, 40 minutes, I book an hour for recording, because that gives people plenty of time and for troubleshooting audio or video problems, or leaving the meeting, coming back in again, so that people aren't like stressed out, like, oh no, this is taking away from my interview time. So that kind of helps people feel a little more calm, so that they're not rushed, at least. So those are ones that I do proactively as part of my process, and those may work for you. And obviously none of those accommodations, they don't cost anything. They don't really cost a lot of extra time or effort for me necessarily. So they're easy to implement, and they are very helpful. And then others that I provided, not as frequently, but they have come up, and they have been sometimes specifically requested by my guests, are things like this. So live captioning. So when I interview guests who are deaf or hard of hearing, a lot of times, I may use Zoom for that, because Zoom has a great live captioning feature, which you may be using right now. And that's been helpful, but that's something that we talk about ahead of time in terms of how that would work, because depending on what recording platform I'm using, I definitely want to make sure that I know how to use that live captioning, and practice that with my guest as well. Video on or off, everyone has a particular preference. I do tend to record video and post it on my YouTube channel. So for that, most people are comfortable with video, but I always ask up front, and some people are not. And then they'll let me know specifically, like, please share the audio only, or like they don't want to see themselves on video, but they're okay like with me publishing it, but it's distracting for them to see it during the recording. Everyone has differences, needs when it comes to video and being on video. So just having that conversation and making the adjustment up front is really helpful. And then name preferences. So some guests have asked me to use a pseudonym or only use their first name in the episode. And again, that's something that we work out ahead of time and that I am able to integrate into there. So again, these are just a few examples. Our blog post has a lot more examples of this. So I just wanted to provide a few to get you thinking about some of these. Okay, so in order to, I wanted to give you a brief case study. So accommodations are important for all of my guests, and a lot of the ones that I've talked about are kind of the more common accommodations that you can use. But now I'd like to tell you about an episode that I did that was, for me, a really huge learning experience as a podcast host when it comes to providing accommodations and stretching my own expectations and understanding of what a podcast conversation could be like. So I'll take a few moments to kind of walk you through what I did for this particular episode. But before I get into that, I've been using the word neurodivergence a lot. So just so everyone's kind of on the same page with that, a very general description of what that means is, basically it's like having a mind that functions in ways that diverge significantly from the dominant societal standards of normal. So people may argue, like, is there such a thing as normal? When it comes to, it's the societal standards of normal. So that kind of varies from community to community. But overall, it's really just having a mind that functions differently. So a lot of times people tend to think of ADHD and autism when they think of neurodivergence. But in this graphic, there's so many other things that fall under this umbrella. As you say, neurodivergence is really an umbrella term. It's not a medical diagnosis. It's a neutral term. It's not necessarily meant to be like positive or negative, and it's meant to be inclusive. So, it includes the conditions under here and includes many other conditions that are not listed here. So that's just a quick orientation of this word as I kind of go into my case study here. So this was a guest that I interviewed on episode 155. I think that was about, 2 years ago now. I interviewed this young man on my podcast. His name is Noah Seaback. He's a writer. He's a disability advocate. He's a mentor to other people with disabilities. And he's also unable to speak. He's autistic and he has apraxia, which basically means it's difficult for him to make voluntary movements. So obviously, if you're speaking, there's a lot of voluntary movements that are required for that. So, that is part of the reason that he's unable to speak. He kind of describes it as like a disconnect between what his brain wants his body to do and what his body actually does. And unfortunately, for most of his life, people assumed that because he couldn't speak, that he just didn't have any thoughts in his head or didn't have any feelings. And his formal education was pretty limited. And he was just sort of, his disabilities were treated as behavioral problems as opposed to, neurological disabilities. But then at the age of 16, he, after trying many methods of different like technologies and things, trying to learn to communicate, he was finally able to learn how to communicate using like a letter board, like with the alphabet on it to spell out words that he wanted to say. And then he started writing and sharing his experience. So for me, I really wanted to include his story on my podcast because these are stories that don't get told, but then there was the challenge of, well, how do you have a guest who is unable to speak as on a podcast that's mainly an audio medium? So this is where I really had to get into my mindset of curiosity and being open to feedback and my values of learning to learn how exactly do I approach this episode and help Noah tell his story. So there were a few things that I had to do for myself. One is like, first of all, checking my own biases and assumptions about, can a non-speaking person be on a podcast? How do they communicate? Because a lot of times it looks different than what you might be used to. And also understanding that just because someone doesn't speak doesn't mean that they aren't capable of thought and presuming, definitely want to presume that they have their own competence and that they are able to communicate in the ways that they share. I also needed to check terminology. I know Kristen was talking about that a little earlier, and I think Charlie's going to talk more about that later. But I had this little graphic here. So I was saying Noah's not able to speak. He uses the term non-speaking as opposed to the term non-verbal, which tends to be probably more popular in the lexicon, but non-speaking is becoming more and more used. And that was a preference that he had because he wanted to say, I'm non-speaking, but it doesn't mean that I can't use words. I am verbal. I can type, or I can spell. So he wanted me to use the term non-speaking. So that's what I did for that episode. Research, I had to understand more about the non-speaking community. It was, there are several non-speaking people who blog and present and share their experiences. So I wanted to make sure I learned more about that. I did a pre-interview with Noah and his communication support partners to just, learn how to interact back and forth, because the flow of conversation is different when you're having a conversation with someone who's not speaking back to you, but is spelling or typing or using communication technology. So it kind of got us used to having that conversation and gave me the opportunity to ask questions and learn more about him before we had the conversation. I did provide the questions in advance, and he was able to kind of spell those out ahead of time. But I also asked impromptu questions, and he said he was okay with me doing that. So he did do some live spelling on the show. And then recording and editing the video. So I wanted to make sure that I was respectful of how he wanted to be shown on video. I added an extra recording in the front explaining more about the non-speaking people and different methods of communication. So those were some of the accommodations that I provided. And the result, I got so much positive feedback from listeners about this episode. It really opened people's minds. It changed the way that people think about people with communication disabilities. And it won some awards for my podcast, which I'm just so honored and so excited to be able to get that those stories out more. And it also opened the door for me to interview more non-speaking advocates. And because I had, kind of, once you have this episode out, I got to be introduced to other people, and I've had a few other non-speaking advocates and disability advocates on my show as well. So that's a really quick run through of my podcast. And if you can have if someone who's non-speaking can be a guest on a podcast with some accommodations, then certainly accommodations can help in almost any other circumstance to have guests on your podcast. So that is my quick overview there. And now I'll turn it over to Charlie, who's going to talk more about some more things that'll help you avoid common mistakes and help your guests feel more comfortable and make your interviews go more smoothly.
Thank you, friend. I appreciate that. And again, if you have not yet entered a question you may have, please feel free to pop it in the Q&A section. And you can also direct it at any one of us, especially if you want to follow up on something we've said. So please feel free to do that at any point. All right, that said, as we welcome podcast guests from diverse backgrounds and experiences, like we've said throughout, approaching these conversations with care and respect can go a long way. And our guests can feel that, right? We can set that intentionality and they can feel, even if we've made a mistake, they can usually feel that it is ideally and hopefully coming from a good place. That said, we want to try to get it right however we can. So being mindful of the language we use, thoughtful language, and framing and showing respect and understanding toward those guests. This means avoiding assumptions, being sensitive to how we discuss topics that may be personal or significant to them. Part of an example of that is if a guest is on my show and uses the term queer to describe their experience, I may need to do a voiceover in post-production, kind of breaking that down a bit to acknowledge its history, because there are, from all generations of LGBTQ plus communities, some who embrace the term queer and use it as a more umbrella term for the community. There are those who use it as a personal term, myself included, as more of an umbrella term for myself and all these different micro labels I have underneath that and micro identities. But there's also older and younger, the whole gamut of generations, that it is a charge. It's an activation because it can come with a lot of tension and crunchy history. So I feel like it's my responsibility as the host to make sure I'm being careful how maybe I use that language with the guests that I'm interviewing, and also that the folks listening understand why I'm using that language and how, and ways in which it may be appropriate or not for folks who don't claim that identity to use it, especially if they're not in LGBTQ plus communities. And every guest will have different comfort levels when sharing their experiences. So respecting their boundaries by allowing them to share what they feel comfortable with and not pushing for more than they're willing to give. I'm thinking of shows like Jerry Springer, and I feel like people know what they're signing up for when they sign up for shows like that, but where they're like intentionally, right, introducing conflict, and people love the drama. I remember when I would be sick and stay home from school, it was like one of the shows that was on. It was like all you could watch at that time. But there are shows that's part of the nature. It's that shock value, and that's what people love. And there's also ways to do that. And I include an example of a show that does that really well in the blog. So I know we keep teasing this blog post. Again, we will drop the link to it later. However, I think there is a show that handles this very well. So I will just allude to that. And when we're discussing potentially sensitive topics, it's really helpful to prepare in advance. Again, I know some of these things have already been said, but I feel like it bears repeating because these are so critical. But when it's a guest who maybe has identities, experiences, etc., that are new to you, doing as much research as you can to sort of prep for that, guests will take notice. They'll see that you've done the work. Even if you're not getting everything right, they'll be able to see that you've done the work. And I would argue that a good chunk of guests who are on podcasts may expect, especially if this person isn't of that experience or isn't from that community, they may not know everything. And we're not asking you to be subject matter experts. However, as much as you can learn and listen, maybe that also means that for that guest, you listen to, if it's possible, other shows they've been on and see what kind of questions come up, how that was handled, etc. Now, it's not to say that you can then ask those same questions and everything because the relationships are different, but it may help to give you some maybe general guidelines of like what was going well in the conversation, and you can reproduce some of those on yours. Now, whenever someone says they're an open book, I still err on the side of caution of not taking advantage of that, because there's always going to be something. They just may not be thinking of it top of mind, or may think it not come up. It may not come up, but I do try to be mindful of that and not take advantage of that, because I think it is this constant tension that I am finding of I want my guests and my listeners to have a good experience. And I don't want that to come at the expense of one or the other. Also, apologizing authentically. If you make a mistake, which will happen, I started at the top of this by not unmuting. Now, that's a mistake I think a lot of us have done, especially for presentations, right? And it was fine. The show went on, here we are. However, there are going to be times that we need to apologize. And maybe it's also that we don't know that we've done something in the moment, but maybe later on we realize, whether it's in post or something, like, oh, actually, you know what? Like, I feel like I made a mistake here. And rather than like trying to ignore it and pretend it didn't exist, like you and your guests are going to remember that happened likely. So I think it's worth, to maintain a good relationship with that person, to follow up on that. And I'm going to give some examples. So by keeping these things in mind, these are just some of the ways we can create a respectful and inclusive environment for all of our podcast guests. And again, also create a positive experience for those listening. That said, um, if we're focusing on LGBTQ plus communities, these are some examples of questions you don't want to ask unless these folks have given permission ahead of time. Let's say you have a transgender or non-binary guest on your show, and you make an assumption that there's going to be some sort of medical transition, be it, gender affirming hormones or some sort of surgery that's gender affirming. asking them something like, and I can't even tell you how many times I've been asked this in my personal life. So are you going to have the surgery? I mean, first off, there is no one surgery. But that is so deeply personal, right? If we think of medical, social, and legal buckets, social questions are a little bit better for us to be asking. Those are a little bit safer. But unless someone has explicitly said, you know what, as a trans person, I want to answer those questions. I want to make it clear it's not just something you ask anybody, but I am happy to answer those. And usually, if I'm answering those kinds of questions, I will make that same kind of disclaimer, and I will say this isn't normally something you'd want to ask somebody. However, I will invite you in. I will answer these. Or things like, maybe if it's a lesbian relationship with two women, maybe it's a gay relationship with two men. So who's the man in the relationship, right? Like reinforcing those cis heteronormative stereotypes. Asking trans and non-binary people, do you feel trapped in the wrong body? Now, while some people may use that language to describe their experiences, not all of us feel that way. And that's why we get caught in that trap of, oh, if I don't feel trapped in the wrong body, then I must not be trans. I must not be non-binary. There can be a lot of imposter syndrome that can come up with people exploring their identities. Or even asking things like, did your family kick you out? Right? And making these kinds of assumptions. So like if you want to go anywhere near these, um like let's say for did your family kick you out, you could ask something more open like, you know, if you feel comfortable answering this, what have you told your family and what has that experience been like, right? Like just more open-ended questions and also not leading questions like again like did your family kick you out? I think things like that can be really helpful when we're also thinking about LGBTQ plus communities, and this goes for other communities as well, we're not a monolith. Not all of us are going to think or feel the same way about things. We don't, because we have varied experiences and identities. So avoid making assumptions or generalizations, and appreciate the unique perspective each guest offers. And that's like one of the big driving points of Allyship is a Verb, my podcast. And also acknowledging like it's a gift if people are sharing this information with you because people can be doing this at risk of their employers finding out, which is why one of my guests is completely anonymous, like wanted to talk more about his experience. But like Carolyn talked about, just used a different name. So wanted to share his experience, but we used a different name, and that was totally fine. We didn't use any of his photos, etc. So just things like that. So talking about mistakes, I just want to normalize this. I make mistakes all the time. It can be tempting to even edit them out, right? Have this perfect, polished episode and position ourselves as this like top-notch host or something. I think people won't trust us as much if we try to like have this clean, polished version of ourselves. So like, earlier I mentioned about how joy, belonging, and authenticity are the top three values of my podcast, but it wouldn't be very authentic of me to edit out all of my mistakes. So I don't mean filtering out the things like all filler words, right? I was talking in the chat a bit ago about how Molly, the audio engineer for the podcast, could have a bingo card of all of my filler phrases and words um easily, but like leaving some of those in is more natural because it's how we tend to speak, right? um and I'm curious, and you don't have to answer in the chat, but like how many of you think that maybe if you leave your interview mistakes in the episodes, that maybe people will think less of you, right? Like that can be something to consider. But then also think about other podcasts you've listened to when they've made the intentionality of leaving like mistakes in there, for example. How did you feel about that? Like what came up for you? So just some things to think about. So interview considerations with mistakes. On two different episodes of my podcast, it featured friends who came on and actually offered me apologies for times that they didn't show up for me in our relationship. And both of these people are longtime friends. So this is Richard. I've known him for so long now. And he's like a grandfather now to me. And then another episode is with Jaffe. And with Richard's episode, we decided to intentionally talk about how, because I used they, them pronouns for the longest time, he refused to use those because he's an English professor. And at one point, he was pro like they, them in the singular. But there was I want to say, university in Florida that was like, no, like, and whoever the head of that department was like, no, it's only plural, blah, blah, blah. So, like, sort of like took that out of him. So by the time he met me to make a compromise, he just used my name all the time instead of any pronouns. So he'd be like, Charlie, 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 no pronouns. Wasn't great. He eventually came around, but that's part of what we talk about in this episode. Jaffe, that one completely took me by surprise. That was not planned at all in terms of the apology that she offered me. So I'm just gonna let y'all listen to that episode and just tease it in that way. But I think it's important for normalizing this for everybody that we are going to make mistakes. And while reparations, forgiveness, etc., are not always possible, I don't think that should keep us from apologizing unless we believe it may cause harm to that person. If we have reason to believe bringing that up again, whatever, then I think that's an exception. But, same way I make mistakes on the podcast, my guests have as well, and have also acknowledged again ones that have come up in our personal relationships. But when a mistake happens, I can feel like a deer in headlights. Don't worry, the deer is safe, okay? I just don't want to I don't want PETA or whatever coming after me, right? But like, have you ever been recording an episode, whether it was just with the guest or in front of a live audience, and you made a mistake? Did you feel maybe like a deer in headlights? I'm white. It's really easy for me to turn red. You will know probably what I'm thinking and feeling. My facial expressions, I also sometimes can't control that because I'm just like in the moment. And it can take a lot of courage and practice to just sort of pause and reflect on your next steps. So, especially if you've caught yourself making that mistake, what is next? What I want to offer, especially if someone corrects you, because we should always try to hold ourselves accountable as much as possible. But when someone corrects us, especially on the show that maybe we're recording or just even in our personal life, I think the best thing we can do is say thank you, because being corrected, being given that feedback is a gift. It means they care enough about the relationship, the dynamic, whatever it is, that they're doing this. Now, I don't always correct people when they use the wrong name or pronouns for me because I don't always have the energy or spoons for that. However, I promise you I'll always hear it. However, I appreciate when people say thank you. And I've started doing the same thing when I get corrected by other people, because I think it takes it a step further than saying sorry. I'm not saying we never apologize. I just think it's best to say thank you. So thanks for correcting me. Thanks for your patience. Thanks for the reminder. Thank you for letting me know. And saying that with sincerity. That said, we don't want to offer performative apologies. Let me know in the chat. Have y'all ever received one of these performative apologies in your life? I have. I hear, sorry, however, this is really hard for me, or I'm sorry you feel that way, or sorry if I offended you. That's why I've yikes in the bottom right hand corner. I've been on the receiving end of too many of these. Yeah. Seeing a lot of people are resonating. And it's possible you have made this mistake too. We're messy. We're messy. What I want to offer, and I want to start jamming through the rest of this as quickly as possible so we can get to some of the questions that came up. I encourage you to look up Dr. Harriet Lerner, 9 Essential Ingredients of a True Apology. I think this is brilliant. No buts, does not overdo. I cannot tell you how many times someone has used, like, for example, the wrong pronouns for me and start like their debut of like thinking there's a Hollywood scout nearby or something. They're like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I can't believe I did that. I'm such a jerk. Like, no, we don't need to do that. You don't need to draw more attention to it. It's okay. But I encourage y'all to check this out. And here's the thing. If we've made a series of mistakes, if we've made some pretty big mistakes, I offer the framework of oops, ouch, thank you. I'm not saying this is exactly what you need to say to someone when you make a mistake, but this is how you can formulate a more authentic apology. The oops is you holding yourself accountable and naming what the mistake was. The ouch is acknowledging how it likely impacted that person. And the thank you is more so for like their patience and getting clear when relevant what you're going to do in the future to reduce the likelihood of it happening again. So this is what it can sound like. Maybe you're, at the end of the recording with your guest, for example, you can say, hey, do you have a moment to hang back just like a few more minutes? I just wanted to acknowledge I wasn't great about using your name and pronouns in the recording. I recognize that it doesn't feel good for you when you get misgendered, and I am taking steps to be better about it. I appreciate your patience, right? That can really go a long way. So, in terms of also follow up, so you can hopefully have these guests like come back and also, as Kristen was talking about, hopefully have them introduce you to more folks that can come on. Seek feedback about their experience. Maybe you think it went well, but maybe that wasn't the same for them. Not everyone's going to feel comfortable giving you that direct, honest feedback. So, what can be helpful is if you have like a more anonymous survey and it's something that you can send folks, maybe at the end of the season or whatever that looks like for you to keep it more anonymous as possible, right? Um, Another thing that you can do is, uh, invite them back if it makes sense, because maybe you weren't able to get through everything. And again, maybe you've made mistakes, but there's still ways you can bring them back and like continue the conversation. Lots of ways that can come up. In terms of listeners, because you are potentially introducing different kinds of guests that are also new to them, consider the audience that normally listens. Maybe you need to provide some more resources for those folks so that they're not getting lost in the conversation. Like Carolyn broke down what neurodivergence is, gave some examples of that, right? Super, super, super helpful. Um, the other thing I'd say is two things. Make it really easy for potential guests to find episodes, because I'm a white person. I look like a white guy to folks. Automatically, that's going to be a flag for people, because there's a lot that can come with that. Even though I am white, but I'm not a guy. I'm non-binary. However, I've sometimes had Black guests in particular tell me the only reason they agreed to saying yes to me was because they saw I had other Black guests on. They listened to those episodes and they felt like I was a safer person to have a conversation with. So you want to nail those previous conversations as much as possible, even if they're a little bit messy, so that those future guests want to get on. So that said, we're going to start going into the Q&A. We've reached the big moment. This is the big activity. What is one small change now that we've like talked through all of this stuff? And again, there's even more in that blog post. What is one small change that you're going to be committed to with your podcast moving forward? So feel free to share it in the chat. If you're still thinking about that, that's okay too. I think it can be helpful to share it in the chat for accountability. But we have got like 5 minutes left. So I want to thank you for your time, especially for those of you that are going to need to pop off. I also want to say that you've got this. And so do these stock video actors. They know that you've got this. Doing new things can be scary, but you've absolutely got this. So now that we're transitioning to Q&A, let's do this. And thank you so much also for the participation in the chat. So I think I saw at least two things come up. Carolyn, it looks like, is going to answer one of these. So Carolyn, take it away.
Yes, yeah. Thank you, Maria, for this question about seeing the pros and cons of sending questions in advance. So, yeah, I was also a bit concerned that if I sent the questions in advance, that the answers I would give back would sound scripted when we recorded the episode together. For the most part, surprisingly, I've not found that to be my experience. Unless, of course, I'm talking with a non-speaking guest, then they do sound more scripted, but that's just kind of specific to that particular type of episode. But for the vast majority, and it might just be because I'm asking people about things that they may not already have like a scripted answer before. I'm not talking about like businesses or marketing pitches. They're telling their stories. So the flow really does seem to go pretty well for me. But if that is a concern, another thing you can do if you don't want to send the questions in advance is at least send the discussion topics. So it's like, I would like to ask you about what it was like for you to get diagnosed with ADHD as a child, or what your relationship with your, how your family reacted, like things that you agree on beforehand. But it doesn't have to be the specific question, but at least it gets them prepared in ways without, it's kind of a compromise. It lets them prepare, but still doesn't, less risk of structured, like super robotic sounding answers.
I will jump in to say that I've had an episode go poorly because of this. Now, I don't want to say that this is always going to be the case. This was also a friend. This was also a friend who it was her first time doing a podcast. there's actually quite a few of those that I've wrangled them onto the show willingly. I did not coerce them. I want to make that very clear. Not just because this is being recorded. And I had to give the honest feedback right away. I was like, hey, I can sense that you're nervous, and that is totally understandable. I'm worried. Like, I know that you needed the questions in advance to feel more comfortable answering and everything. Totally respect that. Wouldn't change a thing about that. I'm noticing that I can tell that it feels like you're reading from some sort of script. So I would like to take a moment and pause and figure out, is there anything we can do to like change in this moment so that you can feel more comfortable and still have that as your anchor and to go back to. However, I can tell and like again it's mostly coming from a place of concern, like as your friend and as the host, like what can we do to make this better. And there's also been times where Carolyn talked about the tech and mic check, that it was going so horribly wrong with a different guest that I was like, listen, I want to do your episode justice, and as much as it pains me to say this, I think we should reschedule, because I can tell that you're flustered, and it's completely understandable. And I don't want that to be the energy that you're putting into this episode. I don't think that will feel good to you. And I don't think it feels good to you now. So I was like, how do you feel about like let's pause. Let's talk through this. Should we record later? And then we decided to do that, and that was great. So I just wanted to add those little pieces. Kristen, did you have something to add to that?
I did. I mean, like as an introvert, like do not send me the questions because I like to be prepared. And I think too, like if you're very clear about the style of your show, like I reiterate in what I send them when I do send guest questions, like this is a casual conversation. Like please listen to an episode so you can hear the style. And I love this though, because it goes back to Carolyn's question earlier. Is there anything I can do to make this interview more comfortable for you? Like, totally connects to what you were saying, Charlie, and like how you checked in with your guests. And that's such a powerful question. And that is the one imperfect action that I'm going to take. I'm going to add that to my intake form for my guests because I don't ask that question. It's so simple and powerful. So I'm learning here too. And thanks, Carolyn.
We're doing it. We got one more question. I know we can do this. We're at time, but I know we can shove this in here. So what do we do to make our interview feel like a safer space? Because no place can truly be safe, but what can we do to make it safer for someone? So, especially if we're thinking about being more trauma informed. So, for example, and this is maybe a bit heavier, I'm thinking if someone had a miscarriage, that can be a really crunchy topic, right? And depending on your podcast, your listeners, your intentionality, maybe there's a content warning at the head of that episode that you let people know that that's going to be the topic. But with that guest, I find, especially if I think I say this in my questions anyway, just coming from that place of curiosity, like Carolyn was talking about, like if you feel comfortable sharing, like could you talk more about this, right? Like I even am showing that like informed consent and everything in the episode. We're not always going to get it right. Sometimes people are going to correct us in terms of language, and I think it's important that we don't stray away from these crunchy conversations. So I think that's a wonderful question. And I don't know, I feel compelled to talk about this, especially since my background's in social work. But I think as much as possible, and we have so many more tools available to us. However we feel about AI, there can be strong opinions, and that's not the topic of this workshop. However, you could also ask like AI for some support in that. Like, what are some more thoughtful ways I could ask these questions? Or what are ways I can be more trauma informed with a guest who's had this experience? Things like that. Um, and I think all that can go a long way. And again, we can still make mistakes. And that's why I wanted to focus so much about talking about like apologies and things like that, how to do that in authentic ways, and also thanking people for correcting us whenever possible. But want to throw that also to Carolyn and Kristen. Anything else regarding like more trauma informed, and safer space kinds of environments for the guests?
Yeah, I was going to say, maybe adding a pre-interview if you don't already do them, just adding that one extra conversation so they have that familiarity with you and you've talked through some things and just that one extra touch point, I think can be really impactful in that way.
Yeah, those are great. I don't have anything to add. I think those are all really great guidance.
And I would say that we can also talk about something that's super crunchy. Those are my words. It's just something that I don't know. I really love the term crunchy for these kinds of conversations, but you also don't need to do it in a way where that person's reliving that trauma because you can like allude to something happening, but maybe also take the time to focus on what was the support they got through that, where are they at now? What resources were helpful to them that we could share with folks who are listening to this episode? So I think there's lots of ways that you can care for the guests and everything in there. Anyway, we've covered a lot. So thank you for hanging around for so long. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for the engagement in the chat. Hopefully, this has you thinking about a bunch more stuff here. Michelle already posted the blog post in the chat, so I encourage y'all to click on that, check it out. Again, bunch of good stuff in there. Thank you again for being here. Super appreciate all of you. Hopefully, we'll see you again sometime. So, Kristen, Carolyn, anything else you want to say to close us out?
Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for participating too.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.